Bhatia. I'm Pankaj Bhatia, Deputy Director of the Climate Program at World Resources Institute. WRI is a global research organization that seeks solutions at scale to protect the environment, advance economic opportunity, and improve human well-being. A very warm welcome to today's event that highlights climate action in South Africa. With us today are speakers representing South Africa's government, cities, academia, labor, and business, all coming together to share their perspectives on bolstering South Africa's economic recovery and achieving a just transition towards net zero emissions. Many thanks to Mac, Steve, Lebahang, Dr. Brita, and Professor Margaret for participating in our discussion. Also, I would like to take the opportunity to express my thanks to all my WRA colleagues here, including Katie, Jamal, David, and Emily. I would also like to extend my thanks to Germany's Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, for making this event possible as contribution to the NDC partnership. We appreciate your support. The COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in a tragic loss of life and significant social disruption. The global economy has also been severely affected. Like many countries, the pandemic has been a great unequalizer in South Africa, exacerbating poverty, inequality, and unemployment. The South African economy contracted by more than 7% in 2020. And unemployment is at an all-time high, with nearly 1/3 of the labor force currently unemployed. Despite the pandemic, the South African government has taken significant steps to address climate change. In the last year alone, South Africa has finalized its long-term climate strategy with an aspiration to begin a journey toward reaching net zero emissions by 2050. South African government has released a national climate change adaptation strategy, has formed a presidential climate commission to oversee and facilitate a just transition, and prepared an updated NDC, an updated draft NDC that is currently out for public consultation, which will see emissions decline from 2025, a decade earlier than forecast. Despite this crisis, all these developments are a very inspirational action representing a much bigger future of hope and progress in South Africa. South Africa's President Ramaphosa also introduced an economic reconstruction and recovery plan in response to the COVID-19 pandemic to stimulate equitable and inclusive growth. And if done right, many of the measures identified in the plan may also have positive benefits for the climate. Indeed, as research from WRI and others show, a greener economic recovery can help countries to enhance resilience and reduce emissions, while at the same time delivering lasting social and economic benefits. This is particularly timely as countries consider how their updated NDCs and economic recovery plans can reinforce each other ahead of COP26 in Glasgow in November. At this critical juncture, it is wonderful to convene this event among thought leaders and experts in South Africa about the opportunities and challenges that lie ahead. In this event, we are bringing together stakeholders with different perspectives. And one of the great outcomes that we would hope to achieve would be that these perspectives give us some insights and guidance in how just transition in South Africa can address and will need to address all these various dimensions that are represented by the different speakers, including ensuring stronger climate action. Major challenges that South Africa faces, as I mentioned earlier, include poverty and unemployment and inequality. And the role of financing is also very important. With this, I conclude my opening remarks. A warm welcome to all of you again to this event. I look forward to our discussion, and I hand it over now to Katie Ross, who will facilitate the conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pankaj, and I would also like to extend a very warm welcome to our speakers today. It really is such a terrific lineup, as Pankaj said. Today we'll be hearing perspectives from government, from labor, from business, from cities, and from academia, all talking about what it means to achieve a just transition toward net zero emissions in South Africa, and particularly set against the backdrop of COVID-19 and the economic recovery plans that are underway. I'm Katie Ross, and I'm an associate with World Resources Institute, and I'll be introducing the panel today and moderating the questions. Just a quick note before we get into the presentations, the audience is in listen-in only mode today, so please pose any questions that you may have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. There will be time at the end of today's event to answer the questions live, and the panelists can also respond in writing as the event progresses. Where possible, please do indicate the name of the panelist to which your question is posed. And the event will be recorded and made available on the WRI event page, likely available within the next day or so. Super, so with that, let's now turn over to our panel and our first speaker. Our first speaker is Mac Makwarela. Mac serves as an interim secretary of the newly established Presidential Climate Commission of South Africa, a position he's held since March 2021. And there he carries out the substantive and administrative work of the commission. Mac also works as the Director of Climate Change Mitigation Policy, Regulation and Planning for the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment in the South African government. And there he leads and coordinates the mainstreaming and development of climate change mitigation related policies in the country. So really a wealth of experience, and Mac, we're incredibly thrilled that you can be here and tell us a bit more about the exciting work that you have underway in the Commission.
Good morning, Kathy, and a good day to colleagues who are here in South Africa listening to this webinar. And thanks, Kathy, for giving me the opportunity to share our perspective on this platform. You would have heard that I wear two hats. I have a hat that I work for government, and the other one being for serving as an interim secretary for the newly established Presidential Commission, Climate Change Commission in South Africa. And today I've been invited to speak as part of the Secretariat serving the Commission. The recovery from COVID-19 pandemic presents the opportunity for countries to reimagine the economic growth. The green recovery will significantly enhance resilience of economies and societies in the face of both severe recession and accelerating environmental challenges. The structural shift created by the pandemic has precipitated the countries to also consider how this moment could be used to reconfigure socio-economic patterns across societies. Given this context, the stronger climate action ought to be viewed as a broader effort to address perennial socio-economic questions in which climate policy is just part of. South Africa, like many other countries across the globe, has adopted the Economic Recovery and Reconstruction Plan for the country last year. And in this plan, we saw the plan as the strategy to unlock the productivity potential for improved competitiveness and sustainable economic growth for the country. When Cabinet approved this plan, it also sought some linkages between the elements of the country's economic and social recovery from the pandemic and putting some stronger emphasis on actions that will enhance climate action. And these include, but not limited to, issues around energy security, the resource use and sustainability, talking about issues around waste management and so forth. There's also an issue around addressing the prevailing socio-economic constraint of the triple challenges that we are faced with as a country in a form of inequality, poverty, and unemployment. The plan therefore highly prioritizes the green economy. And the understanding is that with green industrialization, we are also guaranteed that other sectors will also benefit from this. Talking about sectors such as energy, food, water, and there are other many benefits that will come with green industrializations, like new job opportunities, industries, and new firms. Currently, the country is busy consulting on its updated national determined contribution with a view to submit this before COP26 this year. When we compare this draft NDC to the current one that was submitted in 2015, we believe that this one is more ambitious than the previous one, in that the 2025 target, for example, we have improved by 17%, and the 2030 has improved by 28% when it comes to emission reduction targets. And the measures that have been identified for the implementation of the NDC are well aligned with the COVID-19 recovery plan. And this was the reason that Cabinet approved this NDC for public consultation, because the belief was that the NDC implementation will also address some of the measures that have been identified in the recovery plan. Of course, when we implement the NDC, we will do this with the understanding that the country, South Africa, is a developing middle income country, and there will be a need for us, of course, to request for international support as we scale up our actions to decarbonize our society. So the transition to an ambitious low carbon economy and climate resilient society, or a stronger climate action in a managed and just manner, is paramount, and will be part of the solution to also address these triple challenges that the country is faced with. So the economy for the country is built around the communities and labor forces that place the dependency on high carbon emitting and hard to abate sectors. And these sectors have been seen to be giving us employment. So it is important that as we embark on this journey to implement a more ambitious climate action, we must be mindful of the impact that the transition to the low carbon and a climate resilient society will bring forth to this sector, particularly when it comes to job losses. I'm happy to see that we have a representative from labor who will talk to labor issues. So as such, I won't necessarily go much into details around the job losses that we also want to protect as we implement these measures. But in 2018, the Presidential Job Summit held in Joburg, the social partners identify the issues around jobs as very critical and propose the establishment of a presidential commission to coordinate and oversee the just transition, so that when we implement the stronger climate action, we also addressing the issues of implications or impact on jobs and livelihood. And the commission was approved by cabinet last year. And towards the end of the year, the president appointed the commissioners. It's 22 commissioners representing various sectors like business, experts, civil society, and research institutions. And the idea was to adopt the inclusivity approach, where all stakeholders that are impacted by the just transition are involved in the process. And the main two objectives of the commission is to advise on South Africa's climate response to ensure the realization of the vision, long-term vision that also include just transition. And the vision that we are discussing is the minimum is net zero, but of course there are other corners, stakeholders who are calling for zero emissions. The other objective is for the commission to provide independent advice to government and also provide the independent monitoring and review of progress towards the government implementation of mitigation and adaptation goals. Some of the functions that were given to the commission involves facilitation of the vision towards the 2050 vision, as I've already indicated earlier on. There's also an issue around the advice and facilitation of common understanding on just transition. Currently, with all these stakeholders participating in the just transition process, we need to have a common understanding of this, because it will seem each sector has its own understanding of the concept of just transition. And the initial work of the commission will be to ensure that there's a framework that is owned by all sectors that are involved in the process. The understanding that we also have, and there's a general consensus around this, is to say the recommendations that the commission will provide will be informed by independent and evidence-based guidance. So there is that reliability on data for opportunities that the country must seize as we implement this long-term vision. There are a number of issues that the commission is planning to address that won't necessarily articulate within this short space of time that we have been allocated. But what is important is that as we implement stronger climate action, there will be a need for trade-offs. And these trade-offs are associated with just transition. The commission has a role to play to facilitate that and ensure that there is win-win solution created for all sectors that are impacted by the just transition. Like I've said earlier on, the commission has just been established, so we have not done much. If I can report, we have only sat twice as the commission, and these sessions that the commission held were seen as more of information sharing sessions and downloading session when it comes to information, so that we can understand what various stakeholders are doing in just transition. But the work going forward will involve that we focus on identifying areas that we need to focus on to ensure that we realize that vision as a country, and that will involve identification of pathways that need to be followed. And the work involved will require that there's some modeling exercises to examine the social, environmental, and economic implications of different net zero scenarios and targets. The last meeting that we just had, there was a very strong emphasis on the need for the work program of the Commission to complement the economic recovery plan that was approved last year by Cabinet, so that we can look at the structure of the market required to decarbonize our economy, and how best to incentivize and manage the change in a socially just way. Of course, taking care of the employment and job creation for the country. So we believe that the Commission's work will first encourage the sectors to take more ambitious climate actions, because the functions and objective of the Commission are very much focused on addressing those issues and challenges that have been questions around the hindrances to move towards the low carbon transition and climate resilient society. We are in a position where we can justify why we need stronger, climate action, and come or provide solutions in terms of how best we can implement these actions, and making sure that we don't compromise the livelihoods and employment. With that, I think I will end here, and of course, listen to other colleagues and engage as when we open the question and answer session. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Mac. That was such a fantastic insight into what's happening in South Africa at the moment with the NDC, the Economic Recovery Plan, and the newly established Presidential Climate Commission. And what you guys are doing under the PCC is really innovative and remarkable. And one thing that I think is worth raising to this group is that you're actually screening all of your discussions and debates live on Facebook. So you're really able to bring a wider constituency along in your discussions. So thanks so much for participating today. If anyone has any questions for Mike, please do start dropping those in the Q&A box, and we can take them at the end of the event today. And with that, I'm going to turn over to our next speaker now, and that is Steve Nichols. Steve is leading environment and society programs at the National Business Initiative in South Africa. And in this role, he runs programs that harness the collective effort of business across the areas of energy, climate change, and water. And Steve also leads the NBI program on the SDGs and the NDP. But what Steve is here to talk to us today about is this really remarkable net zero pathways work that he has initiated within the NBI, and also bringing along a lot of stakeholders in that process. So Steve, thank you so much for joining us, and really looking forward to hearing more about what you can tell us about your work.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Katie. Hi, everybody. Yeah, so just an overview of the work. I guess it's rooted in some of the things that Max spoke about earlier. The NDC process that was run by sort of national government to look at a vision for a just transition, made the request or recommendation that more effort, more work is done in decarbonization pathways. And the P4C, as Max mentioned, is looking at decarbonization pathways for different sectors. And so the business sector and the National Business Initiative, in partnership with BUSA, Business Unity South Africa, who are a sort of collective group of business, as well as the Boston Consulting Group, partnered together to look at these net zero pathways, very much in the context of South Africa and our place in the world. And so in my presentation, I'm quickly going to talk through that context, and then drill down into a little bit of the detail. There's not enough time, unfortunately, to go into much of the detail, but to give you a sense of the work that we're doing. So I guess the key contextual point is the science. And so the science is asking us to be net neutral by 2050 within a fair share carbon budget in order to avoid the worst of climate change and basically staying below 1.5 degrees. So that's a key starting point for us and is a boundary condition of the project. What we're doing is try to understand what would it take us to stay within that boundary. But the key thing for South Africa is how that science translates into policy. And if you look at countries around the world that have already made a net zero commitment by 2050 or before, with some of our BRICS partners making a commitment by 2060, there's already quite a lot of international pressure to transition to net zero by 2050, and certainly it's a live and active conversation within South Africa. But what that really means is it has a big impact on trade. And so these are the countries that South Africa trade with, and you can see the bulk of them are already committed to net zero by 2050, with the EU already talking about border tariff adjustments as early as 2023. And they've kind of been quite public about their statement that those border tariffs would apply to countries that haven't done the work and haven't implemented net zero plans in their own right. And so, these are quite important political pressures on South Africa, particularly if you look at the role that trade plays in our balance of payments. And so these are the commodities that we export in order to earn foreign currency. And we use that foreign currency to do predominantly two main things. One is to import liquid fuels, which in the medium term is essential to run the economy, but also to manage debt. And in this COVID context, debt is critically important in South Africa. We have debt to GDP ratios that are now over 80%. And as a consequence of COVID and the investment we need to make, will probably go to over 100%. In addition to that, South Africa has very high debt servicing costs as a proportion of our budget. And so these are really critical components of the economy. If any of these pillars were to decline, it would make our ability to pay debt, would constrain our ability to pay debt, which would mean we might get credit rating downgrades, which means debt would be more expensive, which means it would be more difficult to pay our way out of debt, and then also potentially impacts currency valuations and fluctuations. And so this is really core to the economy, and therefore, if we think about those climate policy changes, what does that mean? We look at platinum group metals. A third of platinum group metal demand is from the autocatalytic converter, and our sixth biggest export happens to be parts and motor vehicles that use the internal combustion engine. So internal combustion engines decline impacts both 1 and 6, and we anticipate the internal combustion engine not being made after 2035, a date that was echoed by the IEA net zero report last week. Coal is going to be out of the economy by 2050. Iron ore, gold, ferroalloys, all dependent on having net zero technologies themselves, but also cheap energy. And so our decisions that we make around energy systems domestically play a key role in managing this balance of payments. So all this really to illustrate that if you were an investment banker looking for a low carbon portfolio, this is probably not it, but that is the context that South Africa has. And also to make the point that this risk is relatively exogenous. It's happening to us. There's not a lot that we can do about it. As these countries change their policy, and that changes demand patterns, that changes our ability to export in foreign currency. But there's another context that's perhaps more important or more close to the hearts of South Africans, and Mac mentioned that, is our social context. And so just some brief stats on that. We have a 0.66 Gini coefficient, the highest in the world, so meaning that we have the highest inequality in the world. Nearly 50% of our youth are unemployed. We have 17.1 million people on social grants. 55% of our population live in poverty. We have 30% unemployment, and 23% of our population have no formal, 23% of over 26 have no formal education and have never worked, which means they're unlikely to work. It's very difficult for people from that background to find work. So these are really key issues for us. And the sort of opening question in my opening slide is, what is our ambition for just transition? What is our ambition globally, and what is our ambition locally? And this Build Back Better campaign, this post-COVID context, this green recovery context needs to be driven by a recognition that we have the opportunity to reset the social context of our planet, to be able to reduce inequality and to drive employment and reduction of poverty. So to recognize the decisions that we make now are critical. We can't afford to lock in long-term uncompetitiveness. We need to recognize that these global value pools are changing and understand what those are. And we need to pursue green sources of preferential trade, of finance and preferential trade, in order to help us transition. And so the study was really put together to try to answer these questions. What is the cost of inaction for South Africa? Some of that we've just talked about. What would it take for South Africa to get to net zero emissions technically? What technologies, by when? What kind of policy support? What kind of international finance support would we need? And then critically, as I mentioned, what socioeconomic implications does this drive, and how do we deal with those? And how do we structure the technology options in a way that helps us achieve those social goals? We're not trying to prescribe to anybody what they should do. We're not trying to drive strategy for any particular sector or business. We really just want to provide that fact base that science asks us to get to net zero. And so how do we do that? And hopefully then build into these other conversations. And we've tried to do this in a very consultative way. We have these open expert groups every 2 to 3 weeks where we share our findings with people, ask them to critique it. We go back and adopt what they say, and hopefully incrementally come to more and more accurate answers. We've currently done work in the electricity sector, which is largely complete. Mining and petrochemicals, we're just winding up. We plan to finish those in the next couple of weeks. We've just started a whole program on socioeconomic impact modeling. And we've also just kicked off FOLU, agriculture, forestry, and land use, and have done some work in heavy industry, focusing on cement and iron and steel. And as I mentioned, these sort of stakeholder engagements are really underpinning all of this work. We've had 9 technical workshops with industry experts. We've had 4 advisory group. We have a separate advisory group made up of business, labor, and civil society. We've had 5 steering group meetings, which are sort of company experts helping guide the modeling. And then we've had 2 sessions of a group of CEO champions, which are sitting at about 25, 26 CEOs now from major multinationals and South African corporations. And so really each sector, this is just a highlight. In the electricity sector, we've kind of gone into this detail of how do we compare different initial systems. So in energy, we've compared the renewables dominant system versus a coal and CCS system versus a nuclear system. And that renewable system comes out cheaper, lower emissions, and lowest risk. We've then looked at what technologies would you deploy to get to net zero, which is functionally building renewables and some gas for peaking. support, and then taking that down to about 12 megatons a year by overbuilding renewables. And to get from there to zero, you would need a combination of either gas and DAC or hydrogen. And then we kind of look at, even within the system, how would you implement it? You could let the model optimize, and we built a Plexos model. It's an industry standard for energy modeling, also the one that Eskom, our state utility, use. And you let that optimize and kind of phases coal out by 2042, which is interesting because that aligns quite closely with the IEA report, which is phasing coal out by 2040. Or we could align with our national policy, the IRP, and that basically keeps coal in the system for quite a lot longer, up to 2049, to try to avoid stranded asset risk. And so we then looked at, what does the CapEx profile look like for that energy transition? What do the emissions profile look like? What does energy cost in each 5-year period? And then what kind of employment that creates? And effectively, you pay a small premium, depending on the model assumptions, between 2 and 7% for your energy for the emissions optimized pathway, but you then get 2 gigatons less contribution to the carbon budget over that period, and you have a far better and more manageable CapEx profile, and you have, as a result, a large amount of job creation in the first 2 decades in relation to construction and maintenance of the renewables grids. And so we've done this sort of level of analysis for each of those sectors, and basically have a technology pathway for each of them leading up to net 2050. What do you have to do in coal, renewable energy, gas, etc. What last mile options are available, as well as a lot of focus on just transition, which I'm going to touch on in a moment. We've done a similar kind of process for petrochemicals with a high degree of uncertainty around synfuels. So South Africa has a big synfuels sector where we basically turn coal and gas into liquid fuels. And so a lot of additional work still being done there. But then again, further detail on gas and when you need it and what kinds of technologies. And certainly a lot of healthy debate has come up as we engage on this around whether you need gas or not. And certainly the IEA report talks about gas as a proxy for flexibility in the system. And so we're doing a lot of extra work trying to understand what are our flexibility options and what would we use instead of gas, which is what the model is determining as the sort of least cost option for flexibility in the South African system. But the key issue, again, just to bring it back to our social context, as you phase out coal in South Africa, the biggest impacts are here in a province called Mpumalanga, where you have a lot of coal mines quite close to coal-fired power plants that will sort of be phased out between 2040 and 2050. And understanding those, even though the gains in jobs nationally for the construction and maintenance of renewable energy is greater than the jobs lost, there's detail in terms of those jobs. They're not necessarily equivalent jobs, but certainly there's a net increase in jobs, but the local impacts are quite significant. So those jobs will be created nationwide, whereas the job losses are quite focused and localized to sectors and to areas. And also to make the point that the energy coal transition is the first of many transitions that we're going to see in South Africa. As I mentioned, we're going to see the same thing in the manufacture of electric vehicles and internal combustion engines. We're going to see that in the liquid fuel sector. We're going to see it in agriculture. And so understanding these just transition principles and sort of in this coal transition and using them to manage these future transitions is a key part of the study. But we've kind of sort of talked to just transition around these 8 dimensions. We narrowly think about just transition as just jobs and reskilling. And certainly when we talk to some developed country companies, they think about it purely as a public relations or a labor relations exercise, making sure you bring the labor along, but it's more than that. It's about creating opportunity and welfare for many. And so there are other factors that we have to consider. We have to think about social and ecological welfare. We have to think about geographic and cultural dislocation. We have to think about inclusion, particularly those that are marginalized in our economy in South Africa and Black women in particular. We have to think about ownership. How do we use ownership as a lever for creating more equality as we transition, and quality of work and service delivery are also key components. Service delivery, for example, in some municipalities, the coal mines ran local services like wastewater treatment. So as those mines move out of the area, then what do we do about making sure that we have similar levels of service delivery for people? So the why I opened up with this idea of what's our ambition for just transition, and this is very much what we're kind of thinking about. Do we narrowly think about jobs and reskilling, or do we think about a bigger and broader package? And that has both global dimensions. How do we rely on international support in order to transition these sectors? And it has local dimensions in terms of how do we deal with these localized impacts. But ultimately, what we want to do is understand a range of key enablers to move us from a labor force of today that may have a certain percentage of permanent, highly skilled, high income people and a certain level of unemployment to a labor force of the future that has more permanent, more highly skilled, more high income people and fewer unemployed people. And that will require a suite of measures, but critically, how do we invest in that particular area? What other industries and skill sets do we need to be thinking about in order to manage this transition, but also to enhance our long-term competitiveness? And I bring you back to perhaps coal coming out of our balance of payments graph, but replaced by hydrogen, for example. And so the opportunity to create hydrogen in South Africa and export to markets like the EU and the US is a big one, and something that we need to be thinking about very carefully. And once we have this kind of depth of knowledge, we can have much more constructive conversations around the global just transition and what kind of support in terms of skills development, finance, and trade partnerships that we might need to make that happen. So really the key question for us all, both locally and globally, is what is our ambition for this just transition? Are we just trying to solve a climate mitigation problem, or are we going to extend that to understand the broader social context that exists in our globe and within our developed world, and start to address things like inequality, poverty, and access to opportunities? So with that, I'll hand back to you. Thanks, Katie.
Steve, thank you so much for giving this intro into your work. I know you can speak for a lot longer about this. I would actually love it if you could drop into the chat any resources you might have on this, or maybe at a minimum, that wonderful presentation you did last Thursday for the PCC, which goes into these sectors analysis in a lot more detail. I'm sure we'd love to learn more about it. So thanks very much, Steve. Just on a quick time check, we may need to run a little bit after the 1/4 of the next hour, just to make sure we have enough time for all the speakers, and also would encourage all the speakers to keep to time, and then we have a little bit of time for Q&A before closing. But let me turn over to our next speaker now. Lebogang, it's wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. Lebogang Malaisi is a National Labour Market Policy Coordinator at the Congress of South African Trade Unions, or COSATU. And Lebogang is also a commissioner in the newly established Presidential Climate Commission. And Lebogang, you're tasked with bringing partners along in this just energy transition in South Africa. And I'd love it if you could just share the trade union perspective in all this, and how you guys are working to put jobs at the center of this climate debate in South Africa.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you very much for the invitation, and just the broad recognition that labor is an important part of a just transition. I think with the work that we've been doing, especially with labor and organizations, civil society organizations, is just the recognition that, social dialogue is our means to achieve a just transition. Within the labor movement, what we've been able to do with most of our advocacy and training is to create an understanding amongst workers that, a transition is happening. With or without us. A transitioning is happening whether we like it or not. The global balance of forces is pointing in that direction. So when you look at the foreign direct investment flows favoring renewable energy opportunities instead of your more fossil fuel-based energy, we've realized that, it's then our responsibility to prepare workers. Maybe just to indicate, some of the work that COSATU has been doing. I mean, we've taken decisions as back as 2011 on issues of climate change and how we start to call for a low carbon economy and setting up the principles of a just transition. Most of them have already been talked about in today's session already. How we look at research and development, how we look at reskilling and upskilling of employees in order to take advantage of the opportunities that reside in a just transition, as well as advocating and calling for jobs and job creation as a key component in the just transition. There are a number of key wins in the just transition, but from the point of view of organized labor and protecting labor rights is, how do we make sure that jobs remain central, and how do we make sure that, hard-won rights that workers have fought for have become protected as part of, the just transition. As part of the work that we're doing, we're creating a blueprint for workers where we'll be assisting them to table just transition demands as part of collective bargainings, whether it be through collective bargaining councils or even at the level of the workplace. Oftentimes people think that workers are only interested in wages. Wages are an important part of collective bargaining, but workers are also interested in their job security, and especially in sectors that we've identified, the three being mining and energy, which is probably the first to transition, but we've also focused our attention on transport as well as agriculture. How do we start to prepare them to start to make the realization that, when net 50 or when net zero comes in the year 2050, what will that employee look like in that particular sector? So what are the key collective bargaining demands we make now to make sure that we're part of those workers as part of this concept of a net zero in 2050. So that is the work that we are seized with at the level of the Federation. We've been going into workplaces, and it's been so interesting to listen to the points of views of workers. I know sometimes, when people especially get into this particular sphere, when we're talking about such highly technical issues pertaining to the environment, environmental sustainability, people often think that, time to talk to workers is sometimes wasted, but it's not. If you take the time to sit down with workers, we did an interesting exercise asking workers what they envisaged the end state would look like and what's key for them in the transition to a low carbon economy. I heard something I've never heard before. A worker asked me about or tell me about, which is a part of what they would want their just transition demands would be. And the question is, in my current job, I have hard-won collective rights. I have particular benefits. I have particular things that make sure that my job is a decent job. How do I transition with all of those hard-won collective bargain rights? And I thought that was profound. And those are things that we forget. We just think that, all you have to do is to take worker from job A to job B. And we forget about all the other things that workers have fought for in job A that they would like to take with to job B as part of the just transition process. So I'm not going to get into, some of the socioeconomic, some of the social issues that plague South Africa. I think, the past two presenters have done great work to talk to those. But I think one of them that's key that we really need to constantly think about, and that's why the P4C is so important. This commission is quite important in its work. When we look at our unemployment rate, if we take into consideration the expanded definition of unemployment that takes into consideration discouraged work seekers, we're sitting at about 40% of working age adults that are sitting at home without a job, including those who are discouraged and no longer looking for work. So that means, to a certain extent, less than half of working age people are sitting at home without a job. If we're going to talk about a transition that has an element of justice, we need to look how we do the redress of this triple challenge. I often look at the way we talk about poverty, inequality, and unemployment. I think we say it so much that we're actually desensitized to what we're actually talking about. We desensitized to the fact that people are sitting at home discouraged, and COVID has made it worse. The COVID pandemic has made it worse. People are discouraged. this P4C, I know with the NDC process, we're trying to send a signal to the international world that we're ready to build ambition and we're ready to be the investment destination for foreign direct investment when it comes to renewable energy. The signal that we also need to send to South Africans is that we can deliver on a just transition and we can deliver on mass opportunities to create employment. You know, people don't want to go and collect a grant from the state. People want to have pride. They want to wake up, they want to have a purpose, and they want to work towards something. A just transition is an opportunity to achieve that. And I know I'm probably going to sound like a broken record, but every time I sit in the P4C and I listen to the discussions, and I think it's the first thing I raised when I looked at the terms of reference, that if we don't send a signal in the terms of reference and in the work plan that we are deliberate about the need to create significant amounts of jobs with this renewable energy sector, I don't think we will have achieved what we have set out to achieve in this particular commission. That's the signal we need to send out to South Africans after this 5-year term has happened, that we are signaling mass job creation. And there's significant work that needs to take place in the P4C that's going to look at a strategic and a targeted jobs plan that's going to look at the things that Steve was talking about. How do we prioritize those groups in our population that were previously economically sidelined? So how are we going to prioritize women of color? How are we going to prioritize the disabled? How are we going to prioritize people who are youth, who are generally just not economically active and not prioritized in economic activity currently? So I know with this NDC process, we're looking to increase on our ambition. And I often say that labor is not the stumbling block to the ambition of the NDCs. Actually, it's actually the opposite. We do want more ambition, but what we do want at the same time is for, you know, issues that are of a social nature that plague South Africa to be taken into consideration. Ambition and the just transition work hand in hand. One cannot outrun the other. I think that's one of the things that has to be highlighted quite significantly in our deliberations, that we are a unique country. We have unique challenges and we have a unique characteristic. We have a unique opportunity as well. So we need to make sure that as we build up on our ambition, we also build up on the element of justice. There are communities that are waiting for this work to bear fruit. So implementation is a big part of the work of the NDC. I know when I speak to the executive director about implementation, they get a bit nervous, but it's important. The work of the just transition at some point needs to get out of the research documents, and we need to actually see something happening. All of these studies, and we've seen so many of them, and they're really good. And the policies, and I'm sure by the time we're done with this commission, we'll have an interesting plan to look at, but the just transition needs to get out of the policy documents. We need to actually see an actionable just transition happening. When I started with this work 5 years ago, I often tell the story, and it's going to be the last as I wrap up. When I went into my first worker education session, and I talked about the just transition, and an elderly man from the back of the training class put up his hand and asked, will I feed my kids and my grandkids a just transition? And that's the question that this P4C has to be grappled. It wasn't directed just at me, but it's the work of the P4C to make sure that, you know, when we look back at this process, we really pat ourselves on the back to look at how we've been able to significantly deliver on a just transition, and we've able to provide significant redress to communities who need it the most, as well as workers. Yes, it's not just about jobs. It's about communities, it's about ownership structures, it's about how do we make sure that those who are not part, have not been part of our economy previously, now begin to participate more actively than previously. Katie, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, as eloquent as always, and I really appreciate you coming on to give the necessary perspective of the workers. Thank you so much. We'll now turn over to Dr. Britta Renkamp, who is a senior researcher at the African Climate and Development Initiative at the University of Cape Town. And her research focuses on science, technology, and innovation in developing countries and links between poverty, inequality, energy, and mitigation of climate change. So Britta, we're thrilled that you can be here. What do you see are the main opportunities in the policy space for progressing South Africa's pathways to net zero? And what is the city's role in all of this?
All right, thank you very much, Katie, and thank you to the previous speakers and to everyone else for joining us. So I'm a researcher at UCT, and I've been working in this space for about 10 years. So I first came to South Africa in 2011, taking up this opportunity. And that was actually quite a critical year for South Africa's climate policy. The NDCs, the National Development Plan started. The COP was hosted in Durban just before there was the first climate policy paper that came out, the National Climate Response Paper, and also the Renewable Energy Program. So it's been 10 years that we've basically had a lot of opportunities in the country and a lot of very important policy progress on the ground. And I just wanted to quickly reflect, not taking much of your time, on basically 3 critical points when it comes to just transition, or let's say the just transitions, because I think there's more than one that needs management. So just quickly on the main challenges, the progress and the opportunities that come from the just transitions as they unfold. I thought I will take to some images to illustrate. So yeah, you can see South Africa's claim to fame, as the previous speakers mentioned, is the inequality. And I just wanted to give you this picture. Johnny Miller's photography has been quite groundbreaking in doing drone images that illustrated inequalities that we might not see on the ground, which has then made it into the Times magazine and illustrated the inequalities. And this is an image, I believe, of Johannesburg. And I've been working with the Coalition of Urban Transitions, which I believe is a very close friend of the WRI. And they're looking into reports of called Seizing the Urban Opportunity and Managing Just Transitions. And I just wanted to add a few points from this work to the conversation. As the cities in South Africa are the home to the greatest private wealth in Africa. So Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Durban basically host most of the wealth in African cities. They're the top 3. And as you can see on this image as well, they're very unevenly distributed for various reasons. However, it is these inequalities, we know that they're there and we talk about them all the time, but it's just also for the international audiences. This image basically reflects what we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and it is everywhere. It's in the political discourse, it's inside people, it's in day-to-day marginalization, and it really is what dominates South Africa and the way it operates. With COVID, the pandemic, the lockdown, and all of that, we've seen more of the housing crisis coming out, a lot more homelessness and people under bridges and at every traffic lights and all of that. So there's a lot more dominant in the public space as well. When we talk climate change in South Africa, it's often comes, it's hard to go beyond the coal question. So what Steve has presented is all very important in terms of transitions. Renewables really need to come on. There's another next transition in hydrogen once renewables are there and all of that. It is often with the dominance of coal in the electricity sector, but also the petrochemical sector that is, closer towards like historical ways of wealth accumulation. It often dominates the discussion in the South African discourse. And then we forget about the other things, which are waste and pollution. So we've got a lot of air pollution issues. The waste storage in the country is basically full. So there's a lot of open landfill. that makes it very vulnerable to other climate impacts as well. You might all remember the images of the Durban harbor when it was full of plastic and the ships couldn't go anymore. That was just the whole harbor was covered with plastic, which was blown into the ocean from the open landfill. And so we also shouldn't forget about these issues when we talk about transitions. And then the impacts, the vulnerability to the impacts. So there's storm, there's drought. Cape Town 3 years ago almost ran out of potable water sources, and there's flooding, and all of these will get worse. So they will make the transitions that happen in other sectors also more difficult, because people get set back all the time because of the impacts that will impact on their livelihoods on a day-to-day perspective. So just to remind you very quickly in terms of the progress that we've made in South Africa over the past 10 years. So the NDP was the National Development Plan, and when Lebogang was just talking about the just transition and thinking about most vulnerable people, the story about can you eat the just transition reminded me of Tandy. Do you remember the story of Tandy and the NDP? So it's the story of thinking of who's the most vulnerable person. So that would be a domestic worker raising her family by herself, living in an informal settlement. And what is it that we can do for her? So basically 10 years in with similar struggling to make life better for Tandy. So now there's the COVID recovery plan. There's the district development model, which is another Kochta-driven plan to somehow change the governance structure between municipalities, districts, provinces, and so forth for more integrated development. We've seen a lot of progress in the renewable energy investments through the RI4P. The RIP, the Integrated Resource Plan, which is a plan that manages the electricity sector, is now finally updated. There has been amendments to the Electricity Act, and there's very limited embedded generation. So there are links that are there, but in terms of, I'll touch on it on the opportunities now, they could be expanded a lot more. I also want to take this as an opportunity to congratulate the commission, the Presidential Commission on Climate Change, for the work that they're doing, and also the Department of Environment on putting the NDC update together, because you have a lot of constraints, which we are all aware of. And they're currently on a roadshow where every day they're presenting to another province for stakeholder consultations. There's also been some progress in the carbon tax, the climate bill updates, and so forth. So there is a lot of movement. But there is always like almost, and that's what I liked about this image of William Kentridge I'm showing you now. You have the happy consultation stakeholder dance on the one side, but then you have this kind of heavy burden that is kind of like hovering along and schlepping, and that you can't really get into. Examples are the continuous fossil fuel incentives that we have in South Africa that are kind of like underlyingly there. Nobody really knows what's going on. We did one paper trying to scratch on the surface, at least to understand them a bit better. There are, what also was mentioned in the chat now, these emergency procurement of these gas ships that give gas-fired power as an emergency to the grid, but they come at very high cost. They're not in the IRP. So there's a lot of like these things that kind of like hover along that aren't part of the happy other side that's happening. And these two basically need to come together so that one can actually make the progress that hasn't fully unfolded over the last 10 years. Just to give you a glimpse of the research that we've been doing is basically to visualize a lot of these competition and coalition that's undergoing. And usually people like talk about, the politics and the networks and the stumbling blocks. So we've tried to visualize these through policy networks analysis so that we can understand better where contestations are, who the critical actors in the space are, just as a reference. not wanting to take too much time to explain this. And then, yeah, just lastly about the opportunities. So I think in the cities and the ideas of thinking multi-level governance of the climate policies, I think there is a lot of the groundwork that's done on the national policy, which is the space that MAC and also the NBI now with their work are basically touching on. There is the NDC work, which serves the transnational coordination of climate change for the NDCs. But I think it is really time to also think subnational and local to make sure that it won't remain an abstract. So there is in the LTS, so South Africa's long-term strategies, there's a provision for urban and provincial climate plans. So I think there's real potential over the next years to turn them into action and not make sure that these will just be other paper dragons. And I think this might also be a good opportunity for international support to help facilitate these consultations, being mindful of the legitimacy, but to make sure that they can have the resources so that they can be held properly. I think there's another big opportunity in the municipal procurement of electricity. So the amendment of the Electricity Act now allows for municipalities to procure their own power from renewables. And it's a two-sided sword, so it could be going very well with those municipalities who can pull it off. But on the other hand, we're also wanting to make sure that the ones who don't have the books to procure themselves don't fall behind and won't get trapped in the next utility spiral. Then there's a big opportunity in municipal waste because the municipality actually own the waste, so they don't have to wait for national government to do anything. They can just manage it, and there's already a lot happening in terms of circular economy that is just coming out of people doing it, but there's a lot of opportunity to do more for business and to do it in a more coordinated way. Another big issue is embedded generation, so that people can actually generate their own power on their roofs from rooftop photovoltaics. Again, there's very limited little pockets in municipalities where this can be done, but in order to do it at scale, it would require more policy opening of the regulation, and that is much better to be doing than procuring gas ships. And another point I just want to make finally are nature-based solutions in terms of the impacts. So there's quite a big area in this where, it's also quite job intensive, or can be, where nature, like managing of specific vegetation and so forth can take away water stress on municipalities and so forth, and it can really help to prevent things like wildfires. So you might have seen a couple of weeks ago, our university was affected really badly. And a lot of it was because of the pine trees that shouldn't have been there. And those could have been cleared earlier. With the fynbos burns as well, but it burns in different ways. So there's a lot of scope for this where people can actually get to work. They don't have to be highly skilled to be doing this. Some of it will depend on international funding, but there's a lot that can actually be done to help. So this is basically my last slide to land this on the positive note. Here are a few resources I just want to share, but I will also put them in the chat. And then I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Britta, for giving that important cities perspective. And yes, devastating what happened at UCT a few weeks ago. With that, I think we're going to transition to our final speaker today. That is Professor Margaret Chitiga, who is the Director and Head of the School of Public Management and Administration at the University of Pretoria, a position she's held since 2014. And Professor Chitiga conducts research in a wide variety of developmental issues. She is an NRF C1 rated researcher that's published both locally and internationally, and also holds a number of positions in scientific bodies and is co-chair of the International Technical Group for the Climate Action for Jobs Initiative. Recently, Professor Margaret Chitiga worked with Cambridge Econometrics on a modelling study that looked at the impacts of a greener economic recovery in South Africa. So thank you so much for joining us today, Margaret, and we're really looking forward to hearing more about your work and your results.
Thanks very much, Katie. Thanks to everyone, and a very big pleasure to be part of this panel. Let me try to share my slides. I hope that you can see them. Is that fine, Katie? Can you see?
We see it well, thank you.
Perfect. So thank you once again for this opportunity. Some of my colleagues from Cambridge Econometrics are part of the panel. So at some point, perhaps they might want to also come in if we have time at the end. So this modeling, again, I have just 10 minutes to talk to you about it. So I'll try to be as brief as I can, but leave you with information that shows you what we have done. The idea in terms of the modeling itself was to undertake a credible quantified analysis of the impact of alternative COVID-19 recovery plans. This is, of course, looking at, for lack of another word, brown versus green recovery plans, and also looking then at indicators of interest, such as economic indicators, social indicators, and environmental indicators, and I'll show this shortly. The model itself, Cambridge Econometrics Global E3ME Energy Economy Environment Model, is a global model with South Africa as one of the countries. So it was possible to separate South Africa into specific modeling for the South African economy. And in particular, the modeling itself was around the plan that was already mentioned by other speakers, the Reconstruction and Recovery Plan announced in October 2020 by President Ramaphosa. Part of what we have been doing since that exercise and even before was to communicate, of course, with various policymakers and stakeholders of interest. We were working also very closely with the ILO and UNEP, among others. So let's go directly to talk about elements of the modeling itself. The modeling, as I said, was of the ERRP plan, in where we try to separate elements within the model into different types of of economic plans. So for instance, we have conventional policies, we have public works programs within the plan, and we have green elements within the plan. It's not necessary for me to mention, but sometimes, of course, some of these are all embedded in the three, but we separated as much as we can these plans. So if we said A, B, and C to represent this, you'll see why I want to emphasize A, B, and C, and then eventually I'll talk about D. So within the conventional plan coming from the October recovery plan by the president were such issues as infrastructure investment, localization enhancement, tourism relief, food consumption boosting with different vouchers. The full budget that we separated here is around the neighborhood of 835 billion over a 10-year period, where the assumption in the plan, in which we also use for modeling, is that the majority of the investment comes from the private sector. 10% of government funding is included to unlock private sector investment. The second part of our modeling separates public works program, which in the plan is a temporary kind of boost to employment over a 5-year period with a budget of a neighborhood of 68 billion. So you can see that the budgets are different because they are specific to the plan by the president. Public works included boosting employment in agriculture, water, forestry, public administration, and others. And then finally, from the plan is some green elements. We can call this Plan C or Simulation C if you wanted from the plan, including subsidizing renewables, including grid investments to accommodate new renewables, including energy efficiency enhancements, including restrictions to coal investments. So of course, this is an area that many of the speakers are already talking about. So the budget for these green elements would be in the neighborhood of 190 billion. And then we asked ourselves, well, what happens if we were to have a more ambitious green recovery plan? So we can call this the green push. This is D. So D is outside of the ERRP, but just shows us what would happen if we pushed further and invested a further 300 billion over 10 years into limiting coal. That's quite substantial limiting in that case, further grid investments and further subsidies for renewables. The way that the modeling is done is to firstly model A, or simulate A policies, then add to that the public works, add to that the green elements, and finally add the green push. So let's go in and look at some of the results that are coming out of this modeling. So just in terms of how you read these different lines, the gray line there on top is just business as usual. Assume that there had not been COVID, where would the economy be? The darker dotted line is the reality with COVID, but with no policies. And then we have the different policies, A being the conventional policies, A and B being conventional plus EPWP, A, B, and C being then adding the green push, the green policies from the ERP, and then the green push would be this other green line. So we looked at gross domestic product, we looked at employment, obviously for its importance, and we looked at CO2 emissions. So concerning GDP, we know, of course, with COVID that we had this huge drop in output because of COVID, and from the modeling we could see that the recovery is really quite sluggish, and even by 2030 with no policies nothing happens in the economy. It doesn't come back to the growth that we would have experienced without COVID. So of course then the recovery plan is clearly welcome, as it now brings in additional growth. As you can see here from the conventional policies, EPWP adds more green policies, even again increase gross domestic product. And you can see with the green push, this additional simulation, that we are in fact meeting or going to where we would have been in 2030 had we not have had COVID in our economy. So this is quite encouraging and very important to show that green policies do boost GDP, and in this case quite substantially with this green push. Concerning employment, which of course many of us already know is and was mentioned several times to be extremely critical in everything that we do. Here is employment, here is unemployment. Employment is mirroring what is happening in terms of GDP, substantial reduction because of COVID, and then very sluggish recovery. And by 2030, if there are no policies for recovery, we won't meet where we would have been in 2030 along this line. But now with the recovery policy, the conventional policies, we can see quite an improvement in employment, already surpassing where we would have been by 2030. Adding EPWP makes it even better. So as we're increasing employment, we're of course reducing unemployment in this case. Green policies add also in net terms to employment. And this green push, you can see also in net terms increases employment. This was some of the discussions already had. I think Steve mentioned a lot of this earlier. So what's very important is look at CO2 emissions. Without COVID, this is where we would have been, the business as usual. With COVID, as we know, we did see a huge reduction somewhat in CO2 emissions, but we can see from the modeling that we would quickly start to go back to where we would have been with no policies. Conventional policies, that is that A and A plus B, while they increase GDP, while they increase employment, can you see they quickly get back to the CO2 emissions we would have had without COVID. So they're good for employment, good for employment and GDP, but not so good for the environment. The green recovery policies in the plan do see quite a reduction in CO2 emissions, and the green push just shows just how much more can be done in terms of reducing CO2 emissions. So this was very important for us to see and to show as evidence that green recovery does indeed have benefits for GDP, for the economy, for employment, and certainly substantially for CO2 emissions. Let me come to a conclusion and then of course to some important caveats here and points that have already been mentioned by others. So clearly we saw that if recovery policies focus only on GDP and jobs, they will result in environmental degradation. That's what we saw with A policies and A plus B. Clearly we see that there is an opportunity now for policy to steer investment decisions to build back better. This is going the green route. Green recovery policies can be at least as effective in boosting GDP and jobs while substantially reducing on CO2 emissions. Other modeling that had been done as part of this modeling was also with the WCMC, UNEP's monitoring center, where it showed very clearly, and this is perhaps something we haven't said enough of in the discussions today, is that we need to keep an eye on natural capital. I think Britta was referring to this just in her presentation. Natural capital will be damaged even with green policies if we did not have policies to support natural capital. So I would say Britta was mentioning some of these issues of reuse of material that we have, recycling, and among others. We also want to be very clear that and agree with what has been said. I think Lebo said a lot here, that green recovery involves economic restructuring. So we need to include a just transition. Both from Mark's presentation to Steve, to Lebo, and to Britta, this is coming out very forcefully. And it's really quite true. While we are losing jobs in coal, in gaining in, say, for instance, renewables, we must remember that livelihoods of those who had been previously dependent on mining, is just one example, need to be taken into account, whether this be in terms of retraining, social assistance, among others. So Katie, this is where I will go, given my 10 minutes. And thank you very much. And I'm presenting on behalf of Cambridge Econometrics. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chitiga. I really appreciate you being here and also underscoring this common thread that's come across all the presenters today, and that's the need for a just transition in South Africa. Thank you also for showing that a greener and more sustainable recovery is possible in South Africa, and it will also have positive benefits for employment and economic growth as well. So really appreciate you bringing to light those messages. With that, from my side, I would like to say a very warm thank you to all of our speakers today, and I'm now going to pass over to David Wasco, who is the head of WRI's international climate action work. And David's going to provide some closing remarks for us today.
Thanks, Katie. And thank you for a great conversation today, everyone. Just to run through the list: Max, Steve, Libgang, Margaret, Britta, and also thank you to everyone who attended the webinar today. Just let me quickly touch on 3 themes that stood out to me. First, that economic recovery plans and economic development more generally can go hand in hand with climate action, and those can really play strongly complementary roles in building a green, resilient, and inclusive future in South Africa. And I think the studies shared today strongly suggest that green economic recovery is indeed possible in South Africa and can promote higher economic activity, increased employment, and at the same time drive lower greenhouse gas emissions. And the economic recovery plan and the NDC can therefore drive in those same directions together. The second thing that struck me was, in fact, that just transition discussion that we heard throughout, in that linking economic recovery to climate action can and indeed must also promote social equity. And we've heard today from multiple presenters how central just transition is. And as Lebogang said, ambition and just transition have to work hand in hand. It has to involve workers and communities at the core. And we heard about the range, the multiple dimensions in which just transition has to take place. And the draft updated NDC for South Africa rightly orients toward this and really puts it at the core of implementing climate action in South Africa. And then third, we heard how critical it is to tackle a range of sectors and issues as part of the transition, sectors such as waste management and approaches such as nature-based solutions. We just heard protection of natural capital as well. And it'll be also essential to address the impacts that climate change itself will have, such as on water. And we need to think innovatively about the role of subnational governments, including municipalities. So this is really a multi-pronged approach that has to be taken. So those are three elements. There was lots to think about here. It was a very rich and I thought enormously helpful conversation. It's been terrific to hear all the different perspectives today. And this really highlights the collective effort and urgency we need to recover from the current crisis while also achieving our goals for a prosperous and climate resilient future. And I think what we heard today also points to a lot of lessons and potential opportunities in other countries around the world as well. So thank you again to the presenters and to everyone for joining today. Thank you to Katie and Jamal and others at WRI for organizing, and have a very good day, everyone.
Thank you.